Hi, and welcome to Empathy for the Devil. This season is brought to you in partnership with London Records.
A heads up for this episode, the story of Sid Vicious deals with drug addiction and overdose, as well as childhood neglect and abandonment. We will also mention animal cruelty, self-harm, and death by stabbing. There will be resources in the show notes for you to check out if you're affected by any of the issues we will be discussing. Hello, and welcome back to Empathy for the Devil. I'm Matt, and today I'm going to be talking us through the story of Simon John Ritchie, the young man you most likely know as Sid Vicious. As bassist of the Sex Pistols, he epitomised the destructive force of the punk movement, but ultimately turned it on himself rather than on society. Whether he was a tortured artist or a rebel without a clue, he embodied the chaos, nihilism and rebellion at the heart of punk. Behind the scenes, those who understood how to harness controversy saw him as a useful tool to further their vision. His antagonising demeanour and self-destructive tendencies made him the perfect punk icon, or the perfect stooge for manipulation. His story reveals a sad truth. A victim of childhood neglect, instability and addiction, Sid's vulnerabilities made him the ideal vehicle for other people's schemes and ambitions. He found his tribe in the nihilism and infamy of punk way before joining the Pistols, unwittingly beginning a narrative where self-destruction equated authenticity. As John Holstrom, founding editor of Punk magazine, once remarked, no one was trying to keep Sid from killing himself. Ultimately, his downward trajectory became the main act, a living circus, as Johnny Rotten described it, reaching its inevitable conclusion when he fatally overdosed at 21 years old. Pushed into becoming a casualty of his own myth, Sid's tale is a stark warning about the exploitation of vulnerable individuals for ideology, corporate and personal gain, and the dangers of dehumanizing people for spectacle. His legacy is a haunting reminder of the cost of living and dying as a vessel for a movement that glorified burning out over enduring.
Wow, powerful words.
It's powerful stuff.
It's funny, isn't it, that little 21-year-old lad could elicit so much. I mean, what you've said, you know, in terms of nihilism and, you know, societal movement and change, and, you know, this sort of fragile little boy was the poster boy for all of that, wasn't it?
Yeah, he was. And I actually really think he was more than the poster boy. He was the vessel. He was the container. That's the point that I'm going to try and make today.
Okay, so it wasn't just the outward appearance.
No.
It was more than that.
Yeah.
I'm interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What made you choose Sid for us?
Well, I guess I'd rephrase the question and be like, well, it was impossible not to choose Sid.
Right.
You know, being that Sid Vicious is who he is, and he is famous for basically dying young.
Yeah.
It would almost be like we couldn't not do it on this podcast. And also a real challenge, probably one of the most challenging individuals that we've talked about, because from an external point of view, he was quite repellent in a lot of ways. And so digging deep to find that place of empathy appeared to be more of a challenge from the outside. Actually, it wasn't, though.
Well, he definitely had star quality, but I suppose in comparison to the other people we've spoken about, he didn't have any musical ability, which we're going to go on and talk about, I'm sure.
Although he claimed he did. And,
really?
You know, yeah. And we were talking about the My Way video just before we started filming. And actually, you know, bearing in mind that he filmed that when he was 21, I think, and he'd only been performing for a very short period of time, you can really see in that he really did have star quality. And imagine what would have happened if he'd been able to continue for another couple of years and actually really develop into a true performer.
Yeah.
It's like, so actually it was, there was definitely something there, although he was not chosen to be in the Sex Pistols for his musical ability. That's definitely true.
For his awesome bass playing.
Well, all right, Sheila, says the musician. But but your eyes gravitated towards him. That's the one you looked at.
Yeah.
Because you couldn't not look at him.
Yeah.
So, Sam, should we light a candle and
Yes.
and get talking?
Yes.
Because it's a really, really tragic tale.
Yeah.
So there's Sid Vicious, right?
Yeah.
Just before I light this candle.
Yeah.
But there's also the lad behind the I don't know, the mask, whatever it was.
Simon, as his mum called him. Yeah.
Okay. So I might light this candle for Simon, because I think that's who we are perhaps going to get to know.
Yeah.
And okay, Simon. So there's the candle lit. So we will hold you gently, and I'm really keen to get to know you.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. Okay.
So, to understand the story of Sid Vicious, we really need to have a look at the 1970s and what was going on externally and culturally at the time, because it was a massive, massive time of change for the world, and particularly the UK. But I'm just going to caveat that with saying that this is not a historical podcast.
We're not historians.
We're not historians. We're not even music historians. So I'm bound to get some stuff wrong, and apologies for that. But I mean, in the 1970s, it was basically about the death of the post-war dream, really, because, you know, we know that at the end of World War II, there was a lot of optimism. There was the NHS, there was a different kind of society. And by the 1970s, that had basically all gone tits up already. Yeah. They were ping-ponging governments, Conservative Labour. It was before Thatcher, in fact. Although Thatcher was going to become a big part of the unease that was to follow. But this all preceded, for those who aren't initiated, Margaret Thatcher, who came into power in 1979. And there was just a lot of economic unrest. There was very high unemployment, I think the highest rate since the war, and particularly for school leavers. That was the biggest area of unemployment. So there was a lot less hope than there previously had been. Yeah. And there was an interesting phenomena, the post-nuclear phenomena, because when nuclear war became a thing after the Japanese bombings, people, particularly youth, began to understand that life was fleeting and it could all end at any minute. So consumerism became a lot more immediate. Right. The kind of pile 'em high, sell 'em cheap, you know, forget about tomorrow, get it all done today. Yeah. That really came in as a result of the nuclear bombs in Japan. And so along came punk, as a kind of expression of all of this unease, this dis-ease, this discontent. And, you know, we can't talk about Sid Vicious without talking about the Sex Pistols. We can't talk about the Sex Pistols without talking about Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood.
Yes, of course.
And we can't talk about Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood without talking about the New York Dolls and television, and New York and the Ramones and all of that. So, I mean, where do you start? It's like unraveling an incredibly long piece of string. And that's the fascinating thing about the punk culture, because what it took to get aggressive looking, loutish looking people on screen actually came from a huge amount of kind of intellectual, academic, socio-economic, cultural ideology that had to be seen to be believed and has to be heard to be believed. And if you want any more information about that, there's an amazing book by a writer called John Savage called England's Dreaming. And I've never read anything like it.
Really?
I have to say, it's the biggest eye-opener.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So Malcolm McLaren was a kind of an idealist,
middle class, working class, middle class,
Jewish middle class. And he met Vivienne Westwood, who was a designer. Right. And, you know, I'm not going to go too much into their history, but let's just say that by the mid-70s, they'd come together and they'd had a series of shops in the King's Road in London.
So they were from the fashion industry.
I mean, Malcolm McLaren was kind of from the world, really.
He'd been over in the States, hadn't he?
He was a hustler. He'd been over in the States and had witnessed the birth of the New York Dolls. And who were, for those who don't know, the New York Dolls were one of the most seminal pre-punk bands that actually were given the label punk before the Sex Pistols had even formed almost. But they self-destructed very, very quickly. And they were followed by a band called Television, who again, were very, very self-destructive. And they television had adapted this French philosophy of le poète maudit, which was a kind of movement of artists in France, of poets, who believed that you had to be penniless and self-destructive in order to create real art.
Right.
But that's where the tortured artist trope comes from, and particularly le poète maudit.
And it's interesting, actually.
Do you like my French accent, by the way?
Yeah, very good.
You know, I grew up in Paris. So
God almighty.
We could tell.
Anyway, Malcolm McLaren had been to New York and had witnessed the birth of bands, or not quite the birth, but had witnessed bands like the New York Dolls, Television, and in fact the Ramones as well, very early doors, and had seen something incredibly powerful. He found it really, really exciting. And he basically decided that he wanted to form his own band. He wanted to put together a band to be the British version of, in particular, Television. And at the same time, him and Vivienne Westwood were on the new iteration of their shop on the King's Road. And by that stage, it was called Sex. Yeah. And what they'd done was they decided to be as subversive as they possibly could be. They wanted to bring the forbidden onto the high street, literally. And so they started getting sex gear, particularly bondage gear, but all sorts of kink gear, and turning it into everyday clothing so that people could kind of go and buy, you know, a pair of fishnet tights.
Go home to their mum and mum and dad would have a fucking heart attack.
Exactly.
That's the point.
Exactly. That's exactly the point. And a big part of this, and I really am oversimplifying it, so apologies, was that they wanted a shop window. They wanted an advertising window for their shop, Sex. And so there was a vision for a band that would dress all in gear from the shop, and then the band would go out and promote the gear.
Oh, so originally that was it was a promotional tool
like
for
a walking, talking advert.
It was a big part of it, absolutely.
Yeah, that's smart though.
Yeah, very smart.
Yeah.
It's almost like he was a social engineer and the Sex Pistols were his social engineering toys, if you like. He was like the master puppeteer with the Sex Pistols as the people who he thought he could control, until John Lydon joined the band. And that was a big, big turning point.
As you're saying that, I'm just thinking about Frankenstein's monster. It's almost like it was, the band was created ostensibly as this sort of art installation of personified of Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm.
It was like an art project.
Yeah, an art.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And actually, then you get John Lydon joins the band, and it becomes real.
Yeah.
It's a real boy as opposed to a Pinocchio.
Yes,
but he was also a very willful character, so I think he became a bit of a competition to Malcolm McLaren.
Yes, definitely. I think primarily because he came preloaded with his own ideas. And so they went, the band went from his idea of a vessel for Malcolm's ideas into something that was being led from the inside by John's ideas.
But then it wouldn't have worked if he'd have got a puppet front man. He was just feeding lines from Malcolm McLaren.
Well, it would have been a fucking boy band.
Well, here's the thing. In the end, he did. In the form of Sid Vicious. So for about 18 months, the Sex Pistols had formed and were very, very controversial. And it's a masterpiece of press and media manipulation by Malcolm McLaren, got to be said, and very interesting story. But we're going to pick it up when the Sex Pistols are on the verge of breaking. It's the end of 1976, the beginning of 1977. They've been signed to EMI. They have started recording their first album, and Glenn Matlock, the bass player and one of the chief songwriters, decides to leave. Because he's had enough, because he's seen the writing on the wall, effectively. There's other versions of the story. There's versions that he was kicked out because he liked the Beatles. That's, I think, what officially went into the press release.
In a punk band.
And there's also a version that he turned up to rehearsal one day and walked into the room, and Sid Vicious, a fan of the band's literally the number one fan, who was normally to be found at the front, pogoing. In fact, it's said that Sid Vicious invented pogoing so he could see above other people's heads.
Oh, wow.
And he walked into the rehearsal room, and there was Sid, who, by the way, couldn't play the bass.
Yeah, but they needed a fucking musician.
But they did.
I mean, they're great songs.
I mean, and if you listen to the final recordings that made it onto Nevermind the Bollocks, they're fucking good. They are actually.
That's the thing. They are actually good.
Didn't the guitarist play all the bass?
Steve Jones did a lot of the bass parts on the recordings that Glenn Matlock hadn't actually played on already. But also bearing in mind that they were signed by EMI, dropped by EMI, signed by A&M, dropped by A&M, and signed by Virgin during this during the recording of the album.
Wow!
And it was chaos. You can hear from this kind of timeline that it was absolute chaos. But they'd also, by the time they signed to Virgin, signed loads of other record deals around the world, exclusively, and then signed to Virgin exclusively.
Absolute fucking chaos.
It was chaos. And this was the time when Sid Vicious joined the band. And he had, like I said, he'd been the super fan. He'd also been known for his violence. There was a famous incident in the 100 Club when he was in the audience, and he attacked a very famous journalist called Nick Kent with a bicycle chain. And another time at a Damned gig, purportedly threw a pint glass at the Damned because they were shit, according to him. And it smashed, and I think someone lost their eyesight.
Really?
So it's kind of, he wasn't known to be the nicest of lads, let's put it that way.
Bit of a loose cannon.
Definitely a bit of a loose cannon, but he looked the part. He looked absolutely brilliant. He was, Vivienne Westwood styled from top to bottom. And he seemed to, like I said in the intro, he seemed to encapsulate the punk ethic of the time. Only what I'll say from the start is he seemed to internalize it. So the kind of self-destruction, nihilism seemed to be turned inward. I think it's time that we started exploring the question, why was Sid Vicious the perfect vessel, the perfect vehicle for the whole punk movement to be poured into? And so let's just have a quick look at his very sad childhood. So as we've said, he was born Simon John Ritchie in 1957, and there's not that much known about his childhood other than his mother and himself. His mother was called Anne Beverly, and they were abandoned by his dad very, very early on. So he didn't factor at all. They were abandoned physically and financially.
And where was this, Matt?
This was in London, but they very quickly moved to Ibiza.
Right.
Sid's mother, Anne Beverly, was really attracted to Ibiza because of its, at that time, in the late 50s, early 60s, it was kind of an emerging centre for bohemia and hippies and idealists and artists and painters, and counterculture. She was very much part of her own subculture, which is really interesting given what happened to Sid. And so off they went to Ibiza, and she unfortunately didn't thrive in Ibiza, and the stories have it that she started dealing drugs to get by, and things went dark quite quickly. Not that much is known about the time, which is frustrating.
Although we were talking earlier and you were saying about her mother.
Yes, that's true. Her, Anne Beverly, Sid's mother, was also someone who'd been abandoned by her own mother very early on as well.
Right, so it's transgenerational.
So there was something going on, and very little. I've really tried to look up information about Anne Beverly's childhood, but I really can't find that much. But we know that she was abandoned by her mother, and then subsequently ended up being a single parent herself in London, then in Ibiza. Then she moved back to London. She did remarry, but her new husband died after 6 months.
Oh, gosh.
So it must have been a really difficult time to be bringing up a child as a single mum, then, with a stepdad for 6 months, and then as a single mum again.
So he lost two dads.
Yeah. And it is known that Anne Beverly took to using drugs at some stage. It's not exactly clear when or how. I think the why is probably pretty obvious. But what we do know is that he dropped out of school. He ended up leaving home, living in a squat for a bit, then coming back home, and then actually being kicked out by his mum because I think she couldn't afford to keep both of them. And she actually said to him, "It's either me or you, and it's not going to be me, so it has to be you."
Gosh.
But was he using at the time? Is that why she asked him to leave, or not?
I don't think so. I think it was just she was clearly not at that stage able to meet his needs as a mother, and she needed to focus on herself and keeping herself alive. And so she literally made him go out and fend for himself. And so his life was squats and drugs and punk gigs.
Right. I mean, there's a sort of cool umbrella over that, but ultimately he was homeless, really.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
living that homeless life.
Yeah.
And he'd been abandoned by his father. And then
generational abandonment.
Yeah, and
traumas.
then his mother abandons him, and then he's homeless.
Yeah, and squats had become something quite socially powerful at the time, and was a thing in the UK, definitely, and there was and that was part of the countercultural movement.
Yeah, there was a scene, wasn't there?
Yeah.
I mean, actually, he never was. He was always in a countercultural movement, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Because he grew up in one in Ibiza.
Absolutely.
So there was never a point where he was.
Oh, right. So that's where he felt at home then.
Yeah.
Right.
So no
that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
Malcolm McLaren made a beeline for him because he was the embodiment, wasn't he, of the periphery, of societal periphery, with a sort of fucking sneer looking in.
He was never going to wear a tie and a suit, was he?
No.
And he'd had no parenting either. It's very clear that I'm sure his mum did her best, but if she was in active addiction, we know that people in active addiction really struggle. And so, what one of my beliefs is that he had no centre, really. And that centre was given to him, or rather he found it in the punk movement.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, you see, because a lot of people we work with, they might say, oh, well, I made sure my kids had a roof over their head and they were fed, and even though I was using drugs, they got what they needed. But ultimately, what children don't get in that environment where the parent is an addict in active addiction is they don't get that emotional connection.
Absolutely.
And the parents can't be emotionally present. Yeah. That's the one thing they can't give because they're stuck in addiction.
Yeah. And it's when we're thinking about attachment, that is going to be disorganized attachment. I mean, that's a really, really good case for it, isn't it? Where there is no sense of self, a centre. No idea how to self-soothe, not been taught. Everything is about the external. I need to reach out in order to change how I feel.
Yeah. And there's nothing being mirrored about expressing need or having needs met or being able to get needs met anywhere.
And talk about disorganized attachment. I mean, this was chaos.
Yeah.
This was absolute chaos. The environment that he eventually kind of found his home in was a completely chaotic environment.
And it would have been familiar and comfortable to a degree, wouldn't it? So
Sid had a best mate called John Lydon, that they'd gone to college together. And Sid started following John's band. And like I've said, he became numero uno fan, number one fan.
Thanks for that.
Yeah.
I was wondering, Matt's multilingual, did you not know?
We've got everything in today.
Terrible
We'll do some Chinese soon.
And anyway, and actually it was John Lydon that gave Simon the nickname Sid after his hamster, apparently. And in fact, there was another member of their gang called John Warble, who others might know as Jar Wobble. And he did it's online if you want to listen to it on YouTube, an amazing documentary that he did for Radio 4, I think, about Sid Vicious and the Sex Pistols. And he said that Sid was unformed. And again, that sort of, that
That's
helps.
really perceptive, isn't it?
It's really perceptive.
Unformed.
Yeah. And it kind of helps the idea along that actually, there was no centre, there was no sense of self until he found something that could fill him.
So he's talking about arrested development there, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, so I think it's more than arrested development, though, isn't it? I mean, it is. You're right.
Yeah.
But it's from a sort of what we've been talking about across the 2 seasons is this sort of disconnect between self, authentic self, and the image, or the career, the persona. But it feels like this lad didn't even have. I mean, how could he have connected to himself?
No, he
even
was
if he
becoming
wanted to.
more the persona than he was himself.
Yeah.
I think that's the key word, disconnection. There was absolute disconnection from anybody and anything. And it seems that in the kind of, in the clothes that he wore and in the gigs that he went to and the people that he hung out with, and he did play in a band before the Sex Pistols, and I think he played in an early version of Susie and the Banshees.
Right.
So, it's clear that he was looking for something.
Scenester.
He was a seeker. He was a seeker on the scene, trying to find his identity, trying to
find your tribe, trying to find your family.
Home,
exactly.
So, Matt, I'm just thinking about, when sort of boys get together and there's like a group of them and there's always roles that they play. And I was just wondering about what role was Sid
it's
in the group?
Interesting question. And, like reading between the lines, I really get the feeling that Sid was almost like, because when he wasn't in the band, he was like almost like, do you remember that TV show, The Word? And people used to cut their pubes off and then eat them and say, I'll do anything to get on TV.
I do.
I think he might have been a bit like that. So, he's probably the kind of guy who'd have gone to flush his head down the loo, like stick his head in the toilet bowl and flush it to see what happened. And then come and tell everyone with water dripping down his face.
And everyone would piss themselves laughing.
Yeah.
And was he harmless? Was he like,
well, no, he wasn't harmless because he had this violent streak. So he was kind of like a dangerous... almost like a dangerous sidekick and a fan, and and the kind of person who'd do anything for attention. Later on in life, he cut himself for attention. He'd literally pick up a knife and cut himself to see what would happen. I kind of imagine that behaviour as someone trying to get their mother's attention, and I've got this sad image that just completely made up of, maybe his mum passed out and a 9 or 10-year-old Simon trying to get his mum's attention, and it's kind of like, and it almost feels like that's what was happening later on in the Sex Pistols. But at the time that he joined the band, it's almost like he was the annoying younger brother. And then quite quickly, he became the centre of attention. So it's like, hey, hang on a sec, how's this idiot become the centre of attention? And you can understand that dynamic happening as well.
So that would grow resentment in the others, wouldn't it?
Especially because he couldn't play. And there was definitely a musicality with the other members, Glenn Matlock, Steve Jones and Paul Cook.
And I've read stories about him cutting himself open with like a lid of a baked bean tin. That kind of
Is it
stuff.
like a sort of an Iggy Pop cut-in, or was it like a...
Well, I think with Iggy Pop, there was a punk element, but there was a performance art element to it.
Okay.
Whereas with Sid, it's very clear that it was dysfunctional behaviour, very regressed behaviour, and like Matt was saying, it was probably a lot more to do with attention that he hadn't got from his parents or his mother in particular.
And there's actually other darker things, Tula, is that he apparently had a habit, allegedly, of killing cats in his older youth, like in his later teens, and he immortalised it in the line, "Today I killed a cat," in his version of My Way.
Well, the problem with that is that it's very associated with serial killers and psychopaths. Right. And it's that side of it. It's more the fascination with death or something going from life to death. That
watching the life drain out of their eyes vibes.
Yeah, that kind of stuff.
Red flag.
Which can be a sign of psychopathy, but not necessarily.
And someone close to Sid actually said, I'm not sure whether Sid is a psychopath or a child at one stage.
The thing is that if you've grown up without ever having, the mother's gaze reflected back at you, and that's in quotes. In other words, that sort of parental feeling of being loved and held, maybe not perfectly, but, you could almost imagine that if his mother didn't have that, she doesn't know how to give it to her child. And then if she's using as well, and then there's, jumping from one house to another, and there isn't there wasn't a grandma, as we've heard with a lot of our stories of our people. There seems to be someone somewhere, an adult, doesn't there?
Yeah, an enlightened witness.
An enlightened witness. Maybe we're looking at some of what happens when there isn't one. There is no enlightened witness, and there is.
Or arguably there was, the closest thing that Sid had was Malcolm McLaren. And as we know, Malcolm McLaren didn't necessarily have his best individual interests at heart.
No.
This was all happening in such a short space of time as well. It was literally, he joined the Sex Pistols, let's just say in January 77, and by 79, he was dead. So it's a really, really short period of time.
Well, the whole band thing happened then, and the whole Nancy thing happened then, and everything happened within that 18 months, 2 year window.
The Sex Pistols had been happening kind of from 75 to 76 was the formation period, and a lot of work had gone into it. But he joined in January 77, and by the summer of 77, they were being absolutely vilified by the press. In the UK, and literally they were under house arrest for quite a long. I mean, not literally, but they'd been banned from playing live at most venues in the UK. And you know what happens in long periods of boredom for people with a propensity for drug use is it goes through the roof. And the other thing to remember is we are still talking pretty much about children. When they signed their contracts, Sid included, I think 3 of them were under 21.
Really?
So there's not a lot of life experience there. And, even in the video from My Way, like looking at Sid, he kind of looks like he's about to start giggling at any time. He's very, very immature. For somebody who'd been through everything that he'd been through, you really do get the sense that he's a big kid because he hasn't had a chance to develop emotionally.
Which is what you were saying about the Arrested Development piece, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like a toddler mixed with a teenager.
And they all seem to be a bit like that to some extent. And there was nobody around them, I imagine there was nobody around them advising them on what was in the contracts that they were signing. They were just doing it because they thought it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, and you'd think that would have changed, wouldn't you? But it has not.
Well, no, it hasn't. But also the contracts with Malcolm McLaren and his business were very in favour of Malcolm McLaren and his business.
Right.
And in fact, there was a really long protracted court case between John Lydon and Malcolm McLaren round about the time that Sid died. So let's talk about Nancy, because obviously there is Sid Vicious, but there's also the fable of Sid and Nancy. Another really, really sad story of somebody with a very, very troubled childhood with depression, a medication. I think she was diagnosed with schizophrenia quite young. She had a suicide attempt at 14.
Right.
So she was clearly a very, very troubled youth from the start. She was also violent. It's reported that she attacked the babysitter with scissors. I'm not sure if it was her babysitter or not, but she attacked a babysitter with scissors when she was about 14. And she also physically assaulted her psychiatrist. So it's like a lot of trouble, a lot of turmoil.
Where's she from?
I think she was from Philadelphia. And she was very, very intelligent. And this comes across, I've watched a lot of interviews with her. And actually, if you get an interview where she's not high, she does come across as very intelligent and quite charming.
Right.
And, she's got her wits about her.
So she came to London.
She came to London.
At how old?
Under 20.
Okay, so late teen,
And
let's
she
say.
was a fan of the New York Dolls in particular. And by the time the New York Dolls had broken up and formed a band called the Heartbreakers, she was effectively, in old-fashioned terms, she was a groupie.
Right.
And it's been said that she came to London to find the Sex Pistols because she'd already burnt all of her bridges on the New York scene. But she definitely came to London at a time when the Heartbreakers were in London, not to be confused with Tom Petty and his Heartbreakers.
No.
That were different Heartbreakers.
I'm glad you pointed that out.
Thank you.
And from a mental health perspective, all those things that you described, it sounds like she was very unwell.
Yeah.
Very unwell.
Absolutely. And anyway, she came to the UK, she made a beeline for the Sex Pistols, and apparently, again, stories differ, but one of the stories is the one that I choose to believe, is that she kind of hit it off with Sid almost immediately.
Right.
And at the same time, introduced him to heroin. So now I'm going to put a story to you now, which is that when someone whose mother is a heroin addict who is brought up in chaos, with the chaos of somebody who's clearly unwell herself, comes across a female young and attractive who is showing him interest and is also a heroin addict and is also reflecting a lot of the characteristics of his mother, there's going to be an instant bond.
Yeah.
And you might describe it as a trauma bond, Julia.
Yeah, absolutely. There'll be an unconscious part of Sid that would have felt his mother in Nancy and been drawn to her without him even realising. Like the pull would have been, I imagine, quite intense.
Absolutely.
And the thing is, with the drugs, it's really difficult because on another hand, you could say that there may have been a part of him that was trying to get close to his mother, even by doing the heroin with her, with Nancy.
And we don't know exactly when his heroin habit started, whether it started before Nancy. It's very widely reported that she introduced him to heroin. It sounds to me like there's a likelihood he'd found it before, because they always like to blame the girlfriend.
Yeah, people like to say those things, don't they?
But anyway, a trauma bond was formed, and one of those relationships that we've discussed before on this podcast was formed, and it was a violent, chaotic, love-hate relationship that was originally fueled by sex, but then the sex wore off, and was characterized mostly by the pursuit of heroin or methadone or a cocktail of other drugs, including barbiturates. And basically, by the end of it, anything they could get their hands on.
Yeah.
And the influence of Nancy on Sid was absolutely undeniable.
Yeah.
And the press even gave her a nickname, which was Nauseating Nancy. Which is not very nice.
No.
Yeah, how surprising that a woman is given a nickname.
Actually, it has rings of Amy Winehouse to it as well.
Literally, that was just about to come out of my mouth.
Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, yes, exactly that.
And it's another example of the using relationship, isn't it? Where one person propels the other person along in their addiction, and then the chances of people getting well are, just seem to diminish over time.
Yeah, and that addiction and dependency was right at the heart of their relationship. So they had this horrific, addicted, codependent, love-hate relationship that was going to culminate, unfortunately, in Nancy's death, as we know, in 1978, in autumn 1978, at the Chelsea Hotel in New York.
I don't know much about that. What happened?
Well, we need to backtrack a bit to the Sex Pistols' ill-fated tour of America at the beginning of 1978. There was a complete and utter unmitigated disaster because, apart from anything else, they had to start the tour late because they'd had visa problems because the Americans quite understandably didn't want to let them in. And so they ended up starting in Atlanta. So just imagine Atlanta in 1978 in kind of, the southern half of the United States, and they were having stuff thrown at them. They were having beer cans thrown at them. They were having pig snouts thrown at them. Sid Vicious got hit in the face by a beer can.
But were they playing to their audience? They sold tickets?
They were playing to some of their audience and then a bunch of cowboys. And you can hear Sid taunting the audience, saying, "Come on, you fucking cowboys."
Well,
it was very real. And it was like, you are literally putting these young men, practically these kids, in the most difficult circumstances in America. And the Warner Brothers, their American label, had to pay $1 million as a kind of surety against them doing anything illegal. So by this stage, Sid Vicious had minders who literally would enforce him to stay on the tour bus and would stop him from going out. So he then kept disappearing to score drugs. And by their San Francisco show, that was reportedly one of the worst rock and roll shows ever, after which Johnny Rotten quit the band, he OD'd. And he started Sid Vicious. Right. He had 2 or 3 overdoses, was rushed to hospital. This shows how desperate they were. They flew out someone from the UK entourage who was training to be a homeopathist or something like that, a homeopath, to help him with his withdrawals. So that was the level of cluelessness. I can
tell you how successful you're going to be with that.
That's not going to
work. Without really much more information.
No.
And his tour manager at the time said, words to the effect of, Sid had his personal life and I wasn't going to put his willy away for him. So read that, into that what you will.
What was the point of the tour?
The point of the tour was to break them in the States.
Yeah. Right.
Not very well thought through.
No.
But-
Or was it to create headlines?
Well,
And chaos.
in Malcolm
Sell the
McLaren's world,
records.
the two things were interchangeable.
Yeah.
You know, they'd had a number one record in England,
Right.
but the tactics that in the UK didn't work quite as well in America.
Yeah,
because
no
I'm sure
shit.
I've seen a newspaper from that time about his overdose.
Yeah.
It was in the papers in the UK.
They became infamous.
Yeah.
They became absolutely infamous. And the decline was just to go on and on and on. And, you know, and during this time, Sid had come back to the UK after the band broke up.
Was he with Nancy at this
He was
point?
with Nancy, absolutely. There's some horrific interviews with them that I can't even make my way through. There's one particularly infamous one of Sid and Nancy in Paris during the filming, I think it was the filming of the My Way video, where Sid is basically falling asleep every other word.
Nodding
And it's
out.
absolutely horrific. He looks like someone who's dying. He really does. But eventually they you know, and they were trying to launch his solo career. That by this stage there were plans for him to have a solo album. He recorded My Way. He recorded his cover of Eddie Cochran's "Come On Everybody."
Oh, yeah.
Remember that one?
Yeah.
And you know there were all sorts of
Planning
things
his
afoot.
solo career.
Yeah,
Are you
yeah.
fucking kidding me?
Well, he had
what, when
mo-
this kid's just collapsing
He
and
lit-
deteriorating in front of their
He
eyes?
literally can't walk.
He was bringing more attention and more money in, basically, so they thought they'd capitalise on it.
So should we move on to the tragic death of Nancy Spungen? Because that's where the myth of Sid and Nancy ended. And she died of a stab wound one night in a hotel in New York.
Right.
And Sid Vicious was accused of her murder.
Oh.
So he was accused of killing her, and there's so many different accounts and recollections of what happened. But what is true is that Sid woke up in the morning and found her dead in the bathroom with loads of blood everywhere, and a stab wound. And, you know, let's not get into the did he do it or didn't he do it. He was certainly arrested for it. He confessed to it. He said, I'm a dirty dog and I did it. And he was arrested and put in on remand in jail. So, and you can also imagine the press frenzy that would have happened around something like that. They would have loved it. This vilified thug, as they had him, then actually kills his
Well,
girlfriend.
it's the scapegoat, isn't it?
Yeah.
He's played the scapegoat. He's been pushed
Absolutely.
into that position, and then he's almost fulfilled all the fears of the public and everything that everyone ever said about him.
Yeah.
Demonised.
Yeah, he's become the devil.
Yeah. And there's talk of a suicide pact. There is talk of, you know, that he did it deliberately with her participation. There's talk of it was an accident while they were arguing about drugs.
Right.
So there's loads of different versions.
Yeah,
And for
it could have
anyone
been
who's
in blackout.
interested, you know, conspiracy theories abound online. You just need to search for it.
And he was never convicted.
Well, he was never convicted because he himself died only a few months later when he was out on bail. And actually, during one of his periods in prison, he detoxed. He had a really, really, really heavy cold turkey withdrawal, I think in the infamous Rikers Island jail.
Without any medication.
Well, I think without any medication.
God.
Yeah,
That'd be
absolute
awful.
cold turkey. Yeah. And he was looking at a trial. Malcolm McLaren was, to be fair to him, trying to raise money for the trial, but he was also looking at a benefit gig to raise money and a film, I think, when Sid was out on bail again. So, you know, ever the entrepreneur. But one day he was let out on bail, and within 24 hours he was dead of a heroin overdose.
Gosh.
Is that?
Awful.
Do we think that's maybe because he got clean in pretty awful circumstances by
Absolutely.
the sound of it?
It could well be. Yeah.
And then
there's lots of reports of people who have got clean in treatment or in prison, and then they misjudge how much they should take when they go back to it, and they're out, and then they take too much and overdose.
So it has been reported that his mother, administered the fatal dose, because by this stage his mother had come out to New York and was doing her best to look after him. So there are all sorts of different reports. One is that his mother confessed just before she died of an overdose, tragically, confessed to administering the fatal overdose because she knew he wouldn't be able to make it through a 25-year jail sentence. There is also the story that it was a self-administered overdose. He talked a lot about wanting to go and be with Nancy. There are reports of a suicide note. There are reports of a note describing the suicide pact. And there is always the possibility that it was misadventure, and more like what you're saying, Chula, is, in the search for getting high again, taking a dose that is going to prove fatal because you've lost your tolerance. So we'll never know is the answer. It's too confusing, too cloudy. What we do know is that his life ended way too soon when he was only 21 years old. As a result of that demise and becoming literally the epitome of the punk ethic, the ultimate punk ethic, that in order to succeed, you have to fail. And I think it was John Lydon who said, live fast, die young, and leave a good-looking corpse. And that's exactly what Sid came to embody. And so he's now way more famous for the way that he lived and died than he is for anything else. But at the same time, one of the most tragic examples of somebody who is just unable to handle the position that they've been thrust into by the manipulation of other people.
And really, if we're honest, he was exploited. He was exploited, and he had an illness and he had trauma, and there was never any there wasn't any help at all, let alone adequate help. And he could have got better had he been given that, but he was exploited and pushed out on the treadmill until he imploded. Or exploded, however you want to look at it.
And it's good to kind of take a minute and remember Simon as opposed to the snarling Sid Vicious that we see on so many people's T-shirts. So that is the sad story of Sid Vicious.
Thank you, Matt.
Which is a roller coaster.
And it's really, I've never really looked at it in that way. I've always, I got into the Pistols and when I was playing guitar when I was about 11 or 12, and it was, something that was very still then exciting to discover. And there was always this kind of real rock and roll, punky, edgy, exciting thing to it. But when you look at it in this light, it's so tragic.
It's a bit like The Wizard of Oz, isn't it? It's like you look behind the curtain and you see 11-year-old Simon who's just, shit scared and doesn't know what to do and maybe just wants a hug from his mum.
So, Matt, where are we leaving Simon?
This is a tough one. This is as tough as DMX, actually. And I've thought about it long and hard. And I kind of think we should leave him at a Sex Pistols gig when he's their number one fan. And he's discovered his tribe. And he feels like he belongs. He's wearing the clothes. He's pogoing, and he really feels like he's got a sense of belonging and a sense of connection. In a way, through all of these disconnected youths, they're all connected. So he's pogoing at a Sex Pistols gig. It's before he's even thought of being asked to join the band, and he's just found his tribe, his identity. And I like to think that there was a period of time where he was actually quite happy.
Yeah, let's leave that lad there. Here's to you, Simon, on your, I was going to say pogo stick. It wasn't a bloody pogo stick, was it?
He didn't need a stick.
He didn't need a stick. It's been lovely to get to know you. God bless.
So, Matt, what's your one for the road this week?
Well, I thought I'd take a slightly different turn this week with my one for the road. A turn in the road, if you like, I would like to recommend a YouTuber called Mary Spender.
Right.
And Mary Spender is first and foremost a musician, has got her own album out, also does a lot of cover versions, interesting and fun cover versions, including a heavy metal version of Sultans of Swing, which I think you've seen, Tudor. I sent you a link a couple of years ago.
Is that your favourite song?
And she also does some really interesting video essays about what it's like to be in the music industry at the moment as an artist trying to make a living. She makes some amazing points, and I think it's a must watch for anybody who's interested in kind of like the underneath of the industry, not just what you see on top.
Lovely.
And that is all for today. We'll be back next week for the final episode of the season. I can't believe it's come around so quickly. Wrapping up with the unforgettable musician Jimi Hendrix, as Tula guides us through the personal truths, stories and struggles, often overshadowed by his legendary status and his untimely death.
If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts.
Do check out season 1, and if you've got any comments or queries, or you want to get in touch with us for any reason, please check us out on Instagram at WeAreATune.
Thanks so much for joining us, and we really look forward to seeing you next time. And if you've enjoyed Empathy for the Devil, why not check out Hit That Perfect Beat, the London Records story, a deep dive into the iconic label behind some of the biggest hits of the last 50 years. See our show notes for more details.